We're going to be in Acts 19. Acts 19 and verse 23. We were talking about Paul having moved to Ephesus, and he met those 12 guys who were baptized in the baptism of John and the resulting rebaptisms, and he laid hands on them. They received the Holy Spirit. We got through them, talked a little bit about Apollos and where he was. The fact that while Paul was in Ephesus, he separated himself from the synagogue finally and taught at a place called the School of Tyrannus, which was an open-air place that he found to teach. He did that for about 2 years. So by the time we get to this passage, he's been in Ephesus for close to 3 years. Lots and lots of good things have happened through the ministry, not just Paul himself, but lots of the members that had been converted while he was there have taken the message to other towns and cities in Asia Minor. So by the time you get to the end of the century, there's a pretty good stronghold of Christianity in Asia Minor. So chapter 19, verse 23, about that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. And we'll just get through one sentence and talk about it a little bit. The way was not just a localized name, evidently. You remember it said that Paul was going to find anybody, if they were of the way, that he might bring them back in chains to Jerusalem. So he refers to it that way. He talks later on in Acts about how he was a representative of the way, that he used to try to persecute. So even in Asia Minor, we were known as the way. And I always have to say, in the modern era, nobody uses that phraseology. The phrase Church of Christ appears a couple of times in the New Testament. The way is Luke's favorite way to describe our movement in the book of Acts. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There's danger not only to our trade, that we will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." So what other name is Artemis known by? You know,
Diana.
That's Diana. Diana is the Greek, and Artemis is the Roman. The folks at Ephesus were very Roman. They were a huge city. I had it in my mind. I was thinking in terms of all these little places that Paul has visited, and he goes to the marketplace. He would go to the marketplace and preach and teach and look for converts in the marketplace. Ephesus had 250,000 people. It was a great big city, even in that time frame. So he wasn't in some, small out-of-the-way place. He was teaching daily in a school in about the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire at that time. So he had lots and lots of people that were paying attention to him. And he was in the same city with one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The temple of Artemis was huge. One of the authors I was reading said if you took the temple of Diana, which was across from Mars Hill on the Parthenon in Athens, you could put 4 of them in the temple to Artemis. It was a gigantic thing. So it was a huge draw, lots and lots of tourists. There was plenty to do in Ephesus otherwise. So people would take their vacations. They would travel to Ephesus. They would go and visit the temple of Artemis. And these artisans had a huge business of making little idols that they could buy and take home with them. Think about when Route 66 was still Route 66, and every little town had a claim to fame, the largest rubber band ball or, whatever, and people would just stop, and there would always be something to buy. If not just a magnet for the refrigerator or a spoon with the name of the state on it, there was always something that was, remember your trip when you came through here by buying something to take home with you. And not all these people worshiped Artemis, but all these people bought souvenirs. And Demetrius was a silversmith, which means that his souvenirs were expensive. And so he had a shop somewhere and was making lots of money. And then Paul comes to town. And if you can imagine Paul walking down the street somewhere near the temple of Artemis, and folks are going to see Artemis's temple, and Paul's telling them, you don't want to see that. If you have to build something to make a god, it's not really a god. God, the real God, the God that made heaven and earth and everything in it, doesn't need to be worshipped with men's hands. Right? Same sermon material that he had in Athens. So you don't want to go over there. So Demetrius finds out about it, and he's up in arms, and he pulls together the whole guild, and they're trying to find a way to keep Paul from doing what he's doing. Interestingly enough, Demetrius was wrong when he says, if we don't stop him now, then we'll fall into disrepute, and our items nobody will buy them anymore, and the temple of Artemis will fall into disrepute, and the world's going to end if we don't do something about Paul. I found an article, I want to say it was in Biblical Archaeology Review, and I stole just a little bit of it. 4 times the size of the Athenian Parthenon. It had 127 gleaming marble columns that stood 60 feet tall and were topped with Ionic capitals. It was the temple of Artemis, the silversmith Demetrius argued in 19, that was being threatened by the way. However, a 16-line Greek inscription discovered during excavations showed that a century after the mission of Paul at Ephesus, in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, the silversmith trade and the cult of Artemis were still going strong. So Paul is converting a lot of people, but Demetrius didn't really have anything to worry about. He was probably losing some money, but his livelihood wasn't going to just suddenly go away because Paul was preaching the good news. He leads with the financial. Right? Demetrius says, I want you to know that we're all going to go broke if we don't do something about Paul. And then he follows up with the religious. Okay, so the money part was the big part for him. And then along with that, the temple of Artemis may be discredited too. So, think about it. You've got a 1-2 punch. You're going to lose money, and the temple of Artemis may be discredited in the long run. All right, verse 28. When they heard this, they were furious, and they began shouting, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Soon the whole city is in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. These city officials were folks that would have supported the Temple of Artemis. Right? It was their great tourist attraction. So they're not in favor of the Temple of Artemis coming into disrepute. They're not necessarily in favor of Demetrius losing money, but they like Paul. And so they're begging Paul, don't go down there. This isn't going to turn out well. Stay where you are. So the assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So again, we've got some anti-Semitism going on. This is a Roman capital city. This is an important place. Lots and lots of folks that were very true to Rome. And at this point, the Jews are persona non grata. They've been run out of Rome, and they've had to settle in other places. And as a result, the people in other places know that they can pretty well get away with being anti-Semitic and doing whatever they want to do. So when I was looking at that, the confusion of the mob, I found another little article that I thought might be interesting to you. I don't remember the speech, but long ago I heard a speech, and someone had said, people are rational beings. And the speaker said, well, a person might be a rational being, but when you get a whole bunch of persons together, they're not rational anymore. Well, here's what this author had to say. The seeds of group behavior are sown even before the members meet. Just knowing that some people are on our side and others are not begins to shape our social identity. So a bunch of people show up, they start shouting. Some people are shouting one thing, some people are shouting another. What do they all have in common? They know that somebody's good and somebody's bad. They're not sure who's who. They're not sure what the issue is, but they're going to shout about it anyway. So some are shouting one thing, some are shouting another. Group affiliation soon grows stronger, bending our behavior further if we undergo an initiation rite. And I almost stopped right there. I thought, oh, there was no initiation rite. But it says a rite as simple as reading rude words out loud can produce a measurable effect. This is from 10 Rules That Govern Groups. So they didn't have to believe everything they were shouting. They just, little by little, the shouting kind of takes shape and people figure out what we're shouting about. So by the time you get to Alexander trying to make a defense, and they say, well, it's a Jew. Well, what's wrong with the Jews? Well, the Jews worship Yahweh. They don't worship Artemis. Artemis is our patron goddess, and we're going to worship Diana. We're going to worship Artemis. And they just start chanting. For 2 hours, they chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, don't you have anything to do in your life besides stand out there and chant for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians"? Evidently not. They didn't have good cable in those days, and so there was nothing for them to do. And they just stood out there and yelled a lot. So the city clerk shows up. He quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven?" There actually was something that fell from heaven in that region. It was a meteor. So big meteor crater. And some people connect the two, that somehow this was Artemis falling from heaven to the earth. I'm not sure how the big rock ends up being a big statue of a woman, but anyway, that was part of the folklore that surrounded this goddess, that she fell out of heaven. And he says everybody knows that, and that's true. I mean, the reputation of the Temple of Artemis was, it was widespread. It was on the same par with the library at Alexandria. I mean, it was that kind of reputation. So folks traveled long distances to see this, and the city manager says, you ought to know that. You ought to understand that. Verse 36, "Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You've brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there's anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we're in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion because there's no reason for it." After he said this, he dismissed the assembly. A lot of power in that guy. Maybe they had shouted themselves out in those 2 hours. They made their point that great was Artemis of the Ephesians. But when the city clerk, it says in the NIV, the city manager shows up, they pay attention to the guy. So enough of them know him politically that they're willing to allow him to kind of have the last word. And he tells them that you don't really have a case, and if you did, this isn't the place to try it out in public. Take it to the magistrates, let them deal with it. Don't take the law into your own hand. Take them to court. So he's getting all of this together and trying to get these people to disperse, and they do. So what could have been a really dire situation for Paul and all of his companions just kind of ends up petering out after a while and doesn't become as terrible as it might have been. But look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. If this is the same occasion, and I think it is, Paul was a little more worried about it than perhaps Luke was. Right? Luke is the chronicler. He's the one that wrote this story down for us. Where was Luke when they were shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians"? Where's Luke right now? He's in Philippi, right? So there are some guys from Philippi who are with Paul. It mentions a couple of names from Macedonia who are traveling with him, but Luke's not. So Luke's going to get this story from Paul and his companions here in a few weeks. They're going to tell him about what happened, and he's going to write it down. But when Luke tells the story, he doesn't have that edge of great fear and trepidation that Paul seems to have. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He's delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. As you help us by your prayers, then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. So Luke says, the city manager comes by and tells them they've been yelling long enough and they need to shut it down, and they all go home and we all live happily ever after. And Paul says, I was scared for my life. I don't know, I thought that something really terrible was about to happen. And when everything is said and done, he says, well, it's a God thing. God took care of us then, and through your prayers, we think God will continue to take care of us. But Paul's response in his telling of it, and I do think that these are the same happenings that are being described. Paul seems a little more upset by it than perhaps Luke was when he wrote it down. You have any thoughts about any of that? Look at chapter 20, verse 1. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. So his first response after this ordeal is, I need to get back to Philippi. So that's the place where folks are that he's going to feel comfortable. He's supposed to get back with Titus, and Titus is very calming to Paul. If Titus isn't where Titus is supposed to be, it really bothers Paul. So he needs to get to Titus. He needs to get to Luke. Maybe he needs to get to Lydia, the jailer. All those folks that are with the congregation at Philippi, they're kind of his home congregation as far as they do more to encourage him and help him than any of the other churches do. So it may be that, when this happens, his first thought is, I got to go to Macedonia. So he's going to go to Macedonia, make the loop around to Corinth, and then take the gift that he's been collecting and take it on to Jerusalem. But Lord willing, we'll take a look at that next week.